Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Brian Moore, and I'm the library director here at Mount Angel Abbey Library. And on behalf of the Mount Angel Institute and the monks of Mount Angel Abbey, welcome here to this wonderful lecture with Dr. Paul Metzger. And I'll give a little brief biography here. Paul Louis Metzger, PhD, is from King's College London. He's professor of Christian theology and theology of culture at Multnomah University and Seminary. He's also the director of the Institute for Cultural Engagement, New Wine Skins, and editor of the New Wines Journal, Cultural Encounters, a journal for the theology of culture. His numerous books include More Than Things, a Personalist Ethics for a Throwaway Culture. That's what we'll be speaking about tonight. Also, Consuming Jesus, Beyond Race and Class Divisions in a Consumer Church from Erdman's, Exploring Ecclesiology, an Evangelical and Ecumenical Introduction, co-authored with Brad Harper and published by Brazo and Baker Press, as well as Setting the Spiritual Clock, Sacred Time, Breaking Through the Secular Eclipse from Cascade, as well as Connecting Christ, How to Discuss Jesus in a World of Diverse Paths from Thomas Nelson, and A World for All, Global Civil Society in Political Theory and Trinitarian Theology, co-edited with William F. Storer and Peter J. Casarella, published by Erdman's. He is a member of the Center of Theological Inquiry, Princeton, New Jersey. Paul and his wife, Mariko, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, have two children, Christopher and Julianne, and one grandchild, Jayla. Please welcome Dr. Paul Louis Metzger.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brian, and it's great to be with you. Thank you so much for the privilege and the opportunity to be here today at Mount Angel Abbey and Seminary. So, people are far more important than things is the title of this talk, bound up with the book, More Than Things, a Personalist Ethics for a Throwaway Culture. We are living today in what Pope Francis calls a throwaway culture. A throwaway culture, what does that entail? From my vantage point, human persons are cheapened as gadgets and as tools to use or commodities to buy and sell and then discard. Why settle for less, though, I might ask, when God has made us for far more? May we throw ourselves into the work of cherishing those around us as persons, not as things. Pop culture often highlights the need of the hour, so to speak, in ways that maybe at times in the Christian community we're not as apt in our depictions. And I'm going to highlight three particular pieces from pop culture as I proceed. First, Ozark, the TV series, where there's this one scene where this couple, Marty and Wendy, good business people, but they find themselves somehow getting caught up in a drug syndicate with a drug lord. And at one point, Wendy's not quite sure yet who she's really dealing with, and she's upset with the decision that had been made by this particular gentleman, the drug lord in this case. And she says, as business partners, we need to communicate better, she said to him. And he goes, Wendy, we're not business partners. Wendy, I own you. And she, of course, was staggered by that. And he said, don't you ever call me on this line again. Macklemore. Wings. I'm from Chicago originally, and I'm a big fan of the Chicago Bulls and Michael Jordan back in the day. But Wings was about the cultural critique of how many children, youth, would kill one another for a pair of Air Jordan sneakers. It was a status symbol. It was a symbol of having arrived. And so Wings is a Macklemore piece where he's critiquing this culture, and one of the lines is, we are what we wear what we are. That's certainly that theme of commodification, of reduction of human identity, rather than living for far so much more that we are persons, not things. And then lastly, a recent film, not too long ago, really astute philosophically in many ways, I think. And what a great actor is Joaquin Phoenix, who basically does this all by himself. I mean, there are other characters, but he carries on, and he has this relationship he develops with his voice-activated operating system. He develops a romantic relationship with her. And there's a sense in which her is increasing in consciousness, and I wonder if he is in some respects decreasing in his value. And there are different critiques, analyses of this movie, but it's a work by Spike Jonze, and really it's about this theme of her, how can technology become personalized, and what might it do to us in the process? And I'm not trying to make a point here about technology and such, though I am concerned as a little would be about the technological age of efficiency, the cult of technique and efficiency. But beyond that, though, it's just a really stellar film addressing this theme of technology and persons. Literary critic Barbara Johnson, I believe at Harvard, had written a variety of works. One was Persons and Things. I love this quote from Barbara Johnson, though, which is staggering and haunting in terms of how might I deal with my relationships. But she says, never let a problem to be solved become more important than a person to be loved. I mean, I have to keep that in mind with my conflicts. I mean, life is about conflict and how we approach conflict in a redemptive way. But here it's about to treat the people as so important and not allow a problem to be solved become more important than the person to be loved. Her book, Persons and Things, where one of the things she says, regardless of what we make of, treating things as persons, that's not really her shtick. But to treat persons as things, that is the cardinal vice or flaw that we must guard against in this book on literary criticism. This is a picture of my son and me, Christopher, back in 2004, New York City. He was heavy then, and in many ways he's heavy now. But it's a privilege to care my son, who's now in a minimally conscious state based on a catastrophic brain injury he endured 3 years ago. But there's a heaviness, and yet it's an honor and a privilege to bear my son. And I often look back at that picture all the time that sits in our family room. This is Christopher a few years ago, not too long before the incident. Christopher with his daughter, Jayla. He adores her, and I believe he still does. It's hard to know always what's happening there in that minimally conscious state. And I know that she cherishes her father. And this is my wife and Christopher. And as my wife would say, he is God's daiji na hito. A very important person, as are we all. A very important person. This is a statement, Hans Urs von Balthasar, riffing off of Maritain. The individual exists for the society, but the society exists for the person. And for Balthasar, he says that if it weren't for Trinitarian orthodoxy in the patristic period and such, would we even have personalism as we know it today? Here is a statement by John Paul II. This norm, in its negative aspect, as one of the pivotal personalists of the 20th century, he says, this norm in its negative aspect states that the person is the kind of good which does not admit of use and cannot be treated as an object of use, and as such the means to an end. And here he is talking about Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative, which is, more framed in the negative. Never treat a person as a mere means, but always as an end in themselves. So that's more the negative side. In its positive form, which is what John Paul II offers, the personalist norm confirms this: the person is a good toward which the only proper and adequate attitude is love. This positive content of the personalist norm is precisely what the commandment to love teaches. Pope John Paul II, from his work, Love and Responsibility. Also, the evil of our time consists in the first place in a kind of degradation, indeed in a pulverization of the fundamental uniqueness of each human person. Again, John Paul writing to Henry de Lubac. His personalism is indeed now no less than it was then, and yet at the same time we continue to see signs of a growing personalist sensibility. Deep down, most of us know that persons merit respect and should not be manipulated and commodified and demonized. John Crosby, in his book on the personalism of John Paul II. And here's a statement. I'll leave it to you to discern where it might be from. We are called by the gospel to embrace the marginalized and break down the privileges that exclude those who are different or disadvantaged. Guided by church teaching, we celebrate the transcendent dignity of each human person, and we accept our common duty to make ourselves neighbors to others and actively serve them. Does anyone know where that's taken from? Mount Angel Abbey and Seminary mission statement. This Protestant evangelical, reading that, I was ready for an altar call. I mean, I would have come forward. I just thought, that is amazing. I love it, and I'll return to it later, okay? It was so striking to me that I said, I got to riff off that. I mean, I got to not rip it off, but riff on it, Keith Richards style. MLK, besides John Paul II, perhaps the other greatest personalist of the 20th century would have been Martin Luther King Jr. Schooled in different traditions. He was at the Boston School of Personalism, that is King. But here, and I was just talking to Dr. Bryan before about this whole theme of, different contexts. We had John Paul II fighting against Soviet socialism in Poland before he was Pope, and we had MLK fighting the other behemoth, so to speak, the capitalist structures of during the Vietnam War and the like. And we'll talk about King's approach right here, right now. In his sermon on the Vietnam War, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. says, we must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. And of course, he's building on President Eisenhower's statement when he left office. His concluding message to the nation was about the industrial military complex. And here, this was Eisenhower, a five-star general, right? He was considered the lead general of the American forces that fought against Hitler and fascism around the world. But he was concerned where it was becoming a business. And King picks up on that with economic exploitation, racism, and militarism, that it's been increasing ever since. Now, getting further into the subject matter of the book and life, today, why are people far more important than things? There are many reasons, but I want to highlight three, and I could define person. I'm often asked to define how I define or describe a person. And a person is an embodied self. As a Christian, I talk about a soul, so it's an embodied soul or soulish body. I think about the matter of self-consciousness and personal agency. I think about human dignity. I think about our relationality. So in addition to individuality, there is interpersonal communion, both on a vertical and on a horizontal level. So those are various aspects of what I mean by a person, from my own definition of personalism. But why are people far more important than things? And this, in part, is going to include statements of dignity. And I'll just highlight something that stood out to me with my son at his care facility. The publisher had asked me, InterVarsity Press, IVP Academic, had asked me, Paul, at the outset of the book, can you share a story or some kind of illustration so that it doesn't read quite like a doctoral dissertation right at the outset? And I said, well, I'll share probably the most visceral, in a beautiful sense kind of way, encounter I had at my son's care facility. We were dealing with the situation, even though he had air conditioning on in his unit, his adult care facility, it would get hot in the room during the summer, even with the air conditioning. And then my son, can sweat quite easily. And we were concerned, maybe he doesn't need sheets on him And the lead nursing administrator said, We want a sheet covering Christopher, and of course we wanted appropriate decorum, but we want a sheet covering Christopher because we want to affirm his dignity. And I was thinking, whoa, as I was working on this book, I was just thinking, I'd love to ask this phenomenal nursing administrator. I'd love to ask her now, could you tell me how it is you understand dignity and such? But I didn't. But I was just struck by that. So that regardless of whether she's thinking about personalism, John Paul II, MLK, the Boston School, or, Balthasar or whatever, I don't know much of where she might be coming from, but I think it's instinctive in many respects. But we can easily take it for granted, even so. And as Christian Smith said in his phenomenal book, the great sociologist at Notre Dame, his phenomenal book, What is a Person? He says, dignity to the person is like wetness to water. It's almost impossible to get at what is wetness, but we just know it exists. We know it's there, and he's a critical realist. He says, just because I can't quite get at what dignity is and define it exhaustively doesn't mean it's not real. It's a challenge, that's the critical part of critical realism, but he believes it's still beyond us. It's not a fiction that we project onto life. So personal identity and human dignity are interconnected. Water, wetness, etc., etc., etc. But why are people far more important than things? I want to just highlight 3 particular items in our 5 hours together today. So I just always want to make sure if someone's alert at this point. But people are unfathomable. People are unfathomable. And people are untouchable or inviolable. And we'll unpack that just a bit. And then people are unrepeatable. So I'm going to highlight those 3 themes. We are unfathomable. Each one of us is unfathomable. And every individual we meet today and beyond is unfathomable as human persons. Each of the persons we are called to serve is unfathomable. And here's what C.S. Lewis said in his phenomenal essay, The Weight of Glory. There are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilizations, these are mortal, and their life is to ours as the life of a gnat. But it is immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit, immortal horrors or everlasting splendors. This does not mean that we are to be perpetually solemn. We must play, but our merriment must be of that kind, and it is, in fact, the merriest kind, which exists between people who have, from the outset, taken each other seriously. No flippancy, no superiority, no presumption. And again, to repeat that line, we have never, ever talked to a mere mortal. I love that. I love that. Unfathomable. Because personhood is not something that we can ultimately quantify. It is beyond quantification. We can get at it, but it's always going to leave us looking for more. It's a mystery. I think it's bound up from the fact that we are created in the image of the Trinitarian God, who is 3 eternal persons in communion. And from all eternity, this God is not first an essence and then persons, or persons then essence, but 3 divine persons in eternal communion. And we're creating the image of that immortal, invisible, infinitely mysterious deity. And we are created in that God's image. So we have never met a mere mortal as persons. We are untouchable. And what I mean by that is inviolable, so that even if someone has been violated, and that is a great horror when someone is violated, still at the core of one's person, one cannot be violated. And here I'm thinking about Viktor Frankl's discussion on this. And for me, in thinking through what we've had to endure, and I don't like to wear it on my sleeve, so to speak, but I do want to speak from life, because we're dealing with life, and ethics is dealing with life. And this statement and others like it, each of the persons we are called to serve is untouchable. Viktor Frankl said, between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space lies our freedom and power to choose our response In our response lies our growth and freedom. And Frankl was reflecting, as you may very well know, on such incidents in his life under the Nazis and imprisoned, I believe in a concentration camp. And he came to the realization that though everything had been taken from him in terms of his freedoms and so much else, the Nazis could not take away his response and his affirmation of his own identity as a person, his dignity. They could not take away his agency, how he might respond. And I think so often, how to make points, not make enemies when I'm advocating for my son. Sometimes I'm that close to losing my dignity and not to affirm another person's personhood as inviolable, as unfathomable, as untouchable, et cetera, as unrepeatable. And I have to step back and think through about my agency and theirs. We have never met mere mortals. And also, to affirm our own dignity and that of others, I can think of few things far better than that, or even close to being better than that. And so that's something I'm taking seriously more and more, because so much of our lives have been turned upside down. But we can still affirm our son's dignity in how we respond, and how we affirm one another's dignity and how we respond. We are unrepeatable. Each of the persons we are called to serve is unrepeatable. I like to say to my students when they're a bit lost with personalism, I say every individual is like a snowflake. I don't think I would ever do too well teaching preschool or first grade, second grade. I just don't think I'd be hired for that role. I think I would flop miserably. I have enough troubles just teaching graduate students. But I said, each individual is a snowflake, right? I mean, a snowflake, what about snowflakes? We all know this science, right? They're unrepeatable, right? There's no snowflake like another. They're all unique. In our assembly line culture of cog in a machine, we are unrepeatable, and we must treat one another as unrepeatable. And here I think of Interstellar. David Brooks' phenomenal op-ed in the New York Times on Interstellar, where he says, it's a cultural event. And he says, in a Newtonian universe, and people can debate, how far to go with this, with the science, but he says in a Newtonian universe where we have this thrust of cog in a machine, what Interstellar is about with quantum entanglement is not cog in a machine, but particle and wave in a vast ecosystem. And you see this father who's, and again, it's been out long enough, sorry for the spoiler. I won't go into too much, but if I do Sound of Music, okay, same thing, sorry if I've given it away, but with Interstellar, he has to go off to save the planet. And he leaves his children behind. But the whole movie, and really in a sense, is through wormholes and black holes seeking to get back to his kids while still trying to save the human race, so to speak. But it's really each person, each individual person is unrepeatable. We are particles and waves in a vast ecosystem. And I have an assignment in a theology, a culture class, where I ask students to think through how to write in a way and to minister in a way, and that's their paper topic, on how to operate beyond cog in a machine, but particle and wave in a vast ecosystem with their ministry context. How do they engage the people in their context? And in church growth culture, and I'm not out to bash church growth or what have you, but so often it can be like, just beam it down to all these satellite campuses without really knowing the context. And in light of the incarnation, we need to make time and space to get to know the people there and not do drive-by. And so how to make sure we are accounting for each context as particle and wave in a vast ecosystem, not cog in a machine. Just put it in, pull it out, no real issues. No, it has a huge impact because each unique person, remove them and it makes an impact on the whole. Freud, the Copernican revolution and a counter-revolution of values. One can debate the significance of Freud in our contemporary age. Some have argued as I was making use of him, he's passé. He's passé. He was a major figure in the day, but that's past. And I think, but his historiography, regardless of what we make of his theories, what he says, for example, in his 1928 lectures on psychoanalysis, and about historiography of faith and science has had such an impact. And people can judge for good or bad. But even in Batman versus Superman, Neil deGrasse Tyson draws from it when he's asked to speak about the Man of Steel from another planet. So here we go. And you're no doubt very familiar with his historiography in his lectures from 1928, I think it is 1928, on psychoanalysis, where he says this. Now that we have this view that the earth, and we're very familiar with this, I'm sure, that the earth is not the center of the universe, but the sun, human dignity and significance has gone out the window. Humans are not that important in the universe at large. So he says Copernicus really threw the first strike against human personhood. And there are 3 strikes in baseball and you're out. So the first strike came from Copernicus. And then he said, then with Darwin, we're not only not lords in the universe, the center of the universe, we're not lords on this planet, that we're somehow unique and distinct, because for Darwin, we are intimately connected with all other species and we evolved from them. So again, humanity has no vital significance. So Freud argued. And then lastly, he says internally, and here he's talking about his own theories, we're not even masters in our own house mentally with the subconscious, the preconscious, and like, we're not in control. Human worth is not all that great. And this naivete of basically of Christianity needs to be done away with. And so Ronald Numbers, and you're probably familiar with his book about, I think it's Numbers, Galileo on Trial, where it's dealing with the historiography of certain figures like, Freud and company. It's striking that individuals like Freud, in trying to dismantle humanity as having significance, actually may have thought that they themselves were significant because they at least knew that we're not significant. Striking, if that makes sense to you. It's just striking. But contrary to this, even though the Earth is not the center of the universe in a heliocentric system, and even though humans are small and seemingly insignificant in comparison to the heavens, yet people are most significant to God. Humanity is at the center of God's affections, and that was never in question in Psalm 8. In Psalm 8, when I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, which you have set in place, what is mankind that you are mindful of them, human beings that you care for them? The point of the psalmist is not how great we are in the universe at large, but how great God's love is for humanity. And the psalmist said, I don't understand it. Lost in wonder, love, and praise, to quote Wesley. It's like, oh my goodness, that God would love us. And by the way, with Darwin never meant to somehow take a shot ultimately at religion, in my estimation. Darwin was simply trying to deal with the natural realms, but as the 13 Theories of Human Nature, that great book from Oxford Press, talks about, he left the realm of ethics to religion and philosophy and said, I'm not dealing with those themes as such. It was really Huxley, Darwin's pit bull, that really caused the problems, so to speak, in his reception in the broader public. But the psalmist, here to deal with Freud, the psalmist is not dealing with how insignificant we are, but how significant we are in terms of God's affections. For Dante and Aristotle, the center of the universe was not a good thing. In Dante's Inferno, what is the center? Hell. So the center wasn't, so it's a distortion. The historiography so often does the problem. And for Aristotle, same thing, it's heaviness. So again, the problem is, not Galileo, it's not Copernicus, and we need to account for the fact of what the psalmist really is getting at. We're going to return to that. Now God did not subject the coming world about which we are speaking to angels. And here I'm taking up Hebrews 2's reflections and development exposition on Psalm 8. Now God did not subject the coming world about which we are speaking to angels, but someone has testified somewhere, what are human beings that you are mindful of them? Or mortals that you care for them? You have made them for a little while lower than the angels. You have crowned them with glory and honor, subjecting all things under their feet. Now, in subjecting all things to them, God left nothing outside their control. As it is, we do not yet see everything in subjection to them, but we do see Jesus, who for a little while was made lower than the angels, now crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. So we're going to reflect on this for a few minutes here. There is a gaping hole in human history. As one commentator, I think it's Thomas Long, in his little commentary on Hebrews says, when we get to this in Hebrews 2, this idea here that as it is, we do not yet see everything in subjection to them, to humanity. All we have to do is look around and see oppression back in the day of Hebrews, and all that's wrong with the world, with the chaos and the turmoil, even the Pax Romana, I might add. But, we don't see everything subjected to humanity yet. So there's an honest accounting for the fact, in the writer of Hebrews, there's a gaping hole in history. We do not yet see everything in subjection to humanity. And yet, there's also a growing hope for the writer of Hebrews with the psalmist. But we do see Jesus. And I like to think of Jesus as the ground, the grid, the goal of creaturely life. As Paul would say, the firstborn over all creation, the firstborn from the dead. We see Jesus. And by the way, I love this painting. It's at a church in Detroit, Michigan. I think it's a Catholic church, if I'm not mistaken, but Jesus in glory surrounded by the angels. And I'm picking up on that for this particular presentation. So at present, what do we see? We see what King talked about in his Vietnam War address. And I think that address, not saying literally that address, but that address that was given April 4th, 1967, a year to the date before his assassination, I think that was really what got him killed. I'm not saying that exact talk, but those themes, as King in the Wilderness, the great HBO movie presents, what he was saying more and more, he was so unpopular the last 3 years of his life, but he was speaking so much truth to the American system of our need to move from a culture of things to a culture of persons. Racism, economic exploitation, and militarism. But it is not only what we see, it is also who we see. Who do we see? We see Jesus, who breaks through divisions between people to make them one, who does not exploit people but purchase them with his lifeblood in a holistic sense, who doesn't get even but makes whole. At present, what do we see? We see people serving so often. What happened here? I don't know what happened to Brian. I lost something here, and I think a gadget took over. So fortunately, you can't see it, but I'm seeing it. I don't know what that is.
Just click on the X right there.
Yeah, let's see. Let's see if that works. Think the battery's still good? So, okay, good. Thank you, Brian. At present, what do we see? We see a presenter having trouble with technology. Besides that, people serving as gadgets and tools to use, playthings to abuse, and cogs in an assembly line free market machine. And by the way, my issues are not with free market economy. My issue is with free market society, as Michael Sandel talked about it in his book, What Money Can't Buy, the great philosopher of public affairs at Harvard, Michael Sandel's book, What Money Can't Buy, The Moral Limits of Markets. And what Jonathan Sachs, the former chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, said is that we must not cross that line where the only thing that has value is money or a price tag. You know, human value is never to be exchanged, so to speak. That's my point here. And this idea of the free market machine. It looks like I lost the clicker. Okay. But it is not only what we see, it is also who we see. Who do we see? We see Jesus, who comes to serve us. And I should put the emphasis on who, as the presentation suggests, who does not come to use or abuse, but abundantly love, who comes to turn things around so that people are not made for the market, but the market for people. It's always striking to me how Jesus always forgot what day of the week it was when he would heal someone, and it happened to be the Sabbath. He just always forgot. He never had his iPhone or didn't ask Siri. I mean, he was always trying to make a point, wasn't he? People are not made for the Sabbath. Sabbath are made for people. If anyone had personalist sensibilities, it's our Lord who created people. Now we return to Mount Angel. While we do not yet see everything submitted to humanity, we do see Jesus, who for a little while was crowned lower than the angels, now crowned with glory and honor, making it possible for all of us to ascend and live into the reality of our transcendent dignity as human persons. Here at Mount Angel, God's people are being trained, and that's what I was really struck by that statement. God's people are being trained to serve as priests, embodying this reality, descending to care for those so often marginalized and dehumanized so that they too might ascend above the angels through God's Spirit and experience Jesus' cruciform glory. Personhood is not dependent on health, wealth, stealth, or how others treat us. This is my son. Our personhood is dependent on Jesus, whom we see in God who sees us in him. What is humanity that you are mindful of them? The Son of Man, that you would care for them. You made him a little lower than the angels, but crowned him with glory and honor. That God seeks us out as the epitome of worth and value in the creation, for the whole creation, but as the pinnacle of creation. You and the people you are shepherding are God's daijinahitos. And I think for all of us, even as a leader, I can easily forget about my own value in our culture today. And I think that theme of secure attachment, I'm working on a book on Hebrews and resilient people for traumatic times. And I think secure attachment that is secure before God and creating the image of God and loved by God is so important for all of us as we care for others. It's only as we know God's love that we can truly care for others well. And I stand by that. We are God's daijinahitos. Why settle for less when God has created us for so much more, for far more than a throwaway culture? So let's throw ourselves into the work of treating those around us and ourselves as persons. Persons are far more important than things. The end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul, for that. We do have some time for some questions. Please, if you have some for Dr. Metzger or comments.
Yes, sir.
Yes. My name is Brother Anselm.
Oh, Brother Anselm. Did we meet at a AAAS event? Were you connected with the Science for Seminaries program here?
No.
Okay. My apologies. I was going to ask you that at some point since we were emailing, but because I was working with some of your colleagues when they were out for the retreats and so. Anyway, go ahead, sir.
Yeah. Thank you for this presentation.
Brother.
I really appreciate it. I have a question. You mentioned a quote or a thought by Balthazar, and you put it this way, that if it weren't for Trinitarian orthodoxy in the patristic era, somehow personhood would be different, especially in the Western mind. So my question is, what is it about Trinitarian orthodoxy that affects or effects an understanding of personhood? And then I guess a corollary would be, if not that, what else?
Great questions. So I'm trying to think how to word this that I don't discount certain figures in my past and make this all very charitable. But I had the privilege of studying at King's College London with Colin Gunton and John Zazoulis. And, it's considered part of the second wave of Trinitarian thought. And I think the disparaging in the third wave, I feel, is wanting in certain respects. And if you don't mind me just going in for a minute on that, there were some errors that might have been made in the second wave of Trinitarian thought that might seem to be going in a social, not socialist, but social Trinitarian direction that was maybe unwarranted from the biblical text. However, The later forms of Gunton's thought, his more mature thought, was far more biblicist in his orientation, grounded in Irenaean themes and the like, so in the biblical activity. So, but what I learned from Gunton and Zizioulas was that, the Greek Orthodox theologian, was that at the ground of the Trinity is a person. Now, of course, we have to guard against seeing an arche, like an eternal emanation type of theme. And so that's why we always have to talk about the essence, right? We have to talk about both the person and the fatherhood and the essence that is shared amongst the three all at the same time. But if we can just account for the fact that the ground of the Trinity is a person, the Father, I think that's hugely significant. And the fact that at the core of God's being from all eternity is not simply, as I said earlier, a divine essence, but we must always, as the Cappadocians said, talk about God as one and three at the same time. So when we talk about God as one and three at the same time, accounting for the essential unity, the essence, the substance, that the West often has, highlighted most, and I think both were dealing with it at the same time. It's not one or the other. But I think with that emphasis on the essence, the essential unity, but a personal unity, I think that was of paramount significance for the development of personalism in Western thought. So that's in part what I think Balthasar is getting at. He, of course, was very close to Karl Barth. I did my doctoral work on Karl Barth. He did a definitive work on Barth. But Barth and Balthasar were close companions thinking through the import of Trinitarian thought for the renaissance of Trinitarian thought for our age. T.F. Torrance is another. And so I think, too, about karma. And, of course, there are personalists in Eastern traditions, and I liked how you worded that, Brother Anselm. But you can find personalist leanings in Confucianism. You can see it at times in Buddhism and such. It's not just a Western thing, and it's not just a Christian thing. You think of Martin Buber. But there's something about how Trinitarian Orthodoxy frames it, and we could talk about the Greek tragedies, we could talk about how person was a mask, so often, that debate. But I hope that was at least helpful for now, but if you want to keep bringing it out, hopefully I didn't go way off course with my response. But did that make any sense whatsoever?
Yeah, no, that
was that helpful, or were you wanting more specificity?
no, that was helpful. The corollary, I guess I follow up too. Like, if not that at the ground of reality, that is, we have an essence that is person.
Yeah.
That you can't think of essence without person. If you don't have that as a definitive marker of personhood, what other options do we have?
Yeah, I mean, to the question that might have been framed rhetorically, I completely concur with the direction of it. I don't know what option we would have. I mean, I think even of a great Buddhist, I do a lot of work with Buddhists and write with Buddhists and such. So we don't see eye to eye on, for example, permanence. And personhood is permanent, a permanent reality, unlike in the Christian tradition, right? But one leading Buddhist thinker said, karma is not bound up with a personal God who willy-nilly judges. It's impersonal. It's just cause and effect. And while I'm not trying to discount karma as some aspect of reality, cause-effect relationships, one does reap what one sows. Nonetheless, I'm so thankful that the one who judges the world is personal and ultimately fatherly. So I'm glad that it's not impersonal. So I wonder what are the implications, to your point, if the ground of the universe is not personal. And again, this God is not willy-nilly like the Greek gods. This God is true to God's being, is a covenant-keeping, making God perfect in God's character qualities. So I don't know where else we could go or would go. So thank you, Brother Anselm. Brother Ed. Ed.
So this is a little bit incoherent of a question, but I'm just thinking about the history of ethics in the past.
When I'm supposed to be taking the questions, do I need to repeat the questions?
No,
okay.
You can repeat the question, whatever you like.
Sorry.
So I'm thinking about the history of ethics in the past with deontological and utilitarian ethics. And it seems like the goal was to develop kind of an objective, rational approach to making ethical decisions and come up with universal rules that would apply kind of everywhere, or some sort of way to calculate, how much utility you're getting from a situation in order to kind of take away the subjectivity from ethics. But it seems like personalism is kind of putting that back in. So I guess part of my question is, do you see that as being a good thing, which apparently you might have been writing on this, but also how do we avoid relativism in that context? Or is relativism something that we really need to avoid?
Yeah, excellent question. So again, deontological ethics, you were saying, could very well be seen as removing the existential, I don't want to say personal, but subjective component. If personalism is trying to bring that in, how does that not potentially lead toward relativism? Is that a problem, type of thing, if I heard you correctly? I thought it was a very coherent question. Hopefully I can give halfway coherent of an answer. From my vantage point, personalism is not to be equated or subsumed with any one of the major ethical traditions. And, at least in Western ethics, I think of deontological systems of various kinds, and consequentialist ethics of various kinds, and virtue ethics of various kinds. And I think one can be a virtue ethicist and personalist. I think one can be a deontological ethicist and a personalist, and consequentialist ethics and a personalist of a kind. I mean, I don't think personalism is ever wanting any of these trajectories to have the final word. And we were talking about phenomenology before, were we not? About that maybe even with John Paul II, which is really trying to deal with what's before you, correct? Is that? Yeah. So I think that always wanting to account for the person that one encounters. But Kant had personalist sensibilities. I think that the categorical imperative that I mentioned, the negative form of what John Paul was talking about positively, never treat a person as a mere means, another individual as a mere means, but always as an end in himself. That has personalist tenets all over it, so to speak. I think that's his Lutheran parents' heritage in many respects. Is I think Alistair McIntyre thinks he was more influenced by his Christian heritage than he would give credit for. But even so, I think personalism is never about a relativism, as I'm thinking of personalism, because while it's never going to allow some neutral, objective principle to have final say, it's as Brother Anselm was talking about, the ground of personalism from a Christian vantage point is the Trinitarian God who's ultimately personal, and that's by no means subjective. There is a subjective component, there's an objective component, but they're reconciled in this God who is supremely personal and is the ground of the universe, shall we say. So that's how I would get at it, but I call it entangled ethics. I'm always in my book looking for entangled eschatological embodied ethics, and I'll go into engaging with a variety of dialogue partners from whatever tradition who is looking for at least some aspect of the sacredness in a culture of the profane. So I hope that was somewhat helpful. Abbott?
So as a seminarian here at the Abbey, listening to this, I'm thinking of practical applications in the future, God willing, and something that I've really, wrestled with in terms of imagining myself in this situation is, especially now, when I think of throwaway culture, I think of people who, for them, they're saying, yeah, I love this, and I'm consenting to it. This is, we had actually a class on Alistair McIntyre talking about relativistic ethics of what if there's a culture where people are beating each other up and that's just what we do. And I was like, well, what if there's a culture where the guy getting beat up is like, no, I want this. And I think the gut reaction, especially as a Christian, is to be like, well, no, you're a person, which means you have this and this and this and this. And for them, that feels like me trying to fit them in a box. So I don't know if maybe you're a researcher, someone who's really thought a lot about this. What's your practical advice for someone who's dealing with a person who is saying, part of my dignity is me consenting to being used as an object in a way that isn't kind of affirming their own belief that I'm trying to put them in a box.
Yeah, excellent question. And it's time to close in prayer. So, no, just kidding. So, no, I'm going to try my best to repeat it. And so, again, we live in a culture where, yeah, at first glance, this might seem great, at least to the Christian, like, yeah, we want to treat people as persons, not things. But what happens in a culture where people want to be treated as things? They want to be abused. So they're going to think we're putting them in a box. And I think it's even in the situation of like friends with benefits. There's this, and I showed this clip in class where the two pop cultural icons, I forget, Justin Timberlake, and then Mia. Oh, it's not Cyrus. I'm blanking. But anyway, they decide that they're friends and they're going to have sexual relations, and they say no emotions, no relationship, or what have you, just sex. And is that even possible? So that's not the matter of seeking to be abused. But I'm just saying that, I raise that with my students because so often today, and Charles Taylor talks about that, mutual consent. We live in a culture of consent. And it's like, that's the dominant thrust. So if someone consents to a one-night stand, well, they're adults, consenting adults. We're not talking about flourishing beyond this realm, but just as long as it's consensual. But what happens if it's consensual abuse, which is more your point? And I suppose what's important for us to take persons seriously and to say, well, let's really reflect. And I think a lot of the times, this takes a lot of time to really invest in getting into it, not in a kind of like looking for the Achilles heel with someone. I don't like the Achilles heel approach to ethics. And that's why we were talking about Charles Taylor beforehand. Talk about an irenic critic who sees the various nuances on the various, and doesn't go for the easy, quick fixes either way, the extremes. So he has to do the heavy lifting as he's thinking with, what has given rise to secularism. So with this type of scenario, I think, it would be more a matter of, let's say it's relativistic. I like what McIntyre, and this is just off the top of my head, I love what McIntyre says in After Virtue, and I think he's dealing with utilitarianism. And he's talking about how for someone like John Stuart Mill, I don't know if he's quite thinking about where John Stuart Mill talks about higher pleasures. So whether it's higher pleasures or higher forms or lower forms of abuse, there's still not a relativism bound up with it. I know you weren't quite asking about relativism, but there's not quite this relativistic orientation, but it's like, still there's something undergirding it all that seems to suggest that it's not just one's mere opinion or just two consenting adults to abuse or toward pleasure. And I think that's where I'd want to explore more. I think that's the type of thing where it's not going to be, okay, gotcha, but with entangled ethics, we're really trying to operate within their system and ask them, so at the end of the day, do you really have a ground for this? And if it is that there really is a ground, like what McIntyre says about Mill, is this something that we should make the case for all peoples everywhere? And if so, is that really fair? And is that not putting someone in a box if they don't move toward a culture? I'm just playing with that. I don't know how much merit that has down the road. Is it Victor? Yeah. But I would want to explore that in a kind of Taylor-esque kind of manner if I could. But I think that's fascinating. I love Kurt Cobain and Nirvana. And, to use Augustine's categories, he was a tortured soul. When he talks about tortured, cheated, diseased, or blessed soul. And I asked, did Cobain really want to be that tortured soul? I mean, I'm wrestling with that. Or when people cut themselves, what is really going on there? Not to dehumanize, to belittle people, but I think people are crying out, for my Christian, people are crying out for love, even when consenting to abuse. And I'm so thankful that Christ doesn't crash into us. Because in LA, as the movie Crash says, people miss that sense of touch so much, they crash into one another because we're always hiding behind metal and glass. But in the incarnation, Christ doesn't do drive-by, he doesn't crash, he touches. He lives amongst us and he touches us holistically in a holy way. And that's where I'd want to go with it. But it's an excellent question, Victor. Abbott, I think you had a comment or a question?
Yeah, I wanted to come back to what Brother Anselm started in on in the Balthazar, and then wonderful that you studied with Zizulas. And I think both Balthazar and Zizulas say that is really the Christian contribution to the development of Western culture, that personhood, that sense of personhood. And you've thought a lot about our throwaway culture. And I'm just wondering, do you think that is it possible to preserve this sense of personhood without being in touch with the Christian revelation, which is where your talk finished? And I mean, it's believers we're saying this is vital for the survival of the race as God intends it. But people like the personhood stuff as far as it goes, but where is it being defended in depth except in Christian circles? Perhaps it is. It seems like you know more, but I'm wondering, of course we have a throwaway culture because we've lost touch with the vital contact with this revelation that is where personhood comes from. So what have you seen as what's producing throwaway culture? It seems to me lack of contact with these roots in some ways.
Well, yeah, thank you, Abbott. And so again, I'm thankful for building upon Brother Anselm's question. I didn't put it for the tape before for the recording, his question, but really, if it weren't personalism framed by way of the patristic period, early Christian sources, what would we have? Is what if I recall correctly, the type of question Brother Anselm was asking, and now the abbot is asking the question, okay, isn't Christianity really the only place, the source for personalism? And we have this throwaway culture. Where might there be personalist ambitions, trajectories, drives to counter this that aren't Christian? Did I hear that correctly, Abbott?
Yeah.
So certainly, back in the mid-20th century, Martin Buber, as a Jewish leader, I think in the Jewish tradition, it's birthed in personalism because of the Hebrew scriptures. I am the Lord God. I am who I am. I will be who I will be. I am the Lord. It's a personal God. Let my people go. Don't enslave them. And so Buber takes issue with Karl Barth. While he respects Barth, Barth wants to frame it ultimately in a Christian trajectory, and I think make space for Buber. But Buber says, "With I and thou, I'll stand on my own Jewish feet. Thank you very much," so to speak. But there's this dialogue in the mid-20th century with Buber and Barth. So I definitely see it in the Jewish tradition. That's where we come from, so to speak, and we build upon it. I think it's especially hard in the social sciences in many respects. And this is what Christian Smith argues for in his book, What is a Person? University of Chicago Press, where he says in the social sciences, in David Brooks on his personalist essay, it's a great op-ed on personalism, what's the philosophy needed today, says that we often look at people based on their taste, their consumer impulses. We look at people based on their genetics, and this is my own riffing, their genetics or their racial categories, but we don't see that for all those things being true, gender, biological, consumer appetites, we're more than that. And a lot of times in social sciences, it's reduced to those things. So Christian Smith is operating as a social scientist who is calling for personalism, and he's not trying to do it, though he is a devout Christian, he's not trying to do it as a Christian, so to speak, as best as he can, if you're familiar with that great book. He says, of course I am this, but I'm wanting to argue for it alternatively, just to speak to the social scientists generally. But I have found it in Hindu circles. Again, I'm thinking of the classics, but there are personalist trajectories in Hinduism. So I think, while it's not going to be at the level of Christian faith as I see it, and how we see personalism developed in the Christian faith, I see these antennas, I see these trajectories, and I see people crying out in a variety of contexts for that, just like I said with pop culture. Sometimes the critiques in Hollywood and analyses are calling for something more. So, I mean, I could keep going, but also Michael Sandel, whom I mentioned before. I don't know where he stands ultimately in terms of faith. I know he's Jewish. Is he coming at it from a Jewish philosopher? Does he have Christian underpinnings? I don't know, but his whole trajectory is personalist. When he's dealing with genetic engineering, when he's dealing with what money can't buy, the moral limits of markets, he is one of the greatest philosophers today who is dealing with what I take to be personalist trajectories in a very public secular university context. So those are just some of the tenets that I would seek to draw attention to. But even for my Zen Buddhist friends, though they are not personalists in the way that we think of it, they always deal with matters of the individual before them phenomenologically as Zen Buddhists, and they do see the person. Very much so they see the person, even though their reigning philosophy does not account for permanence, as we would hold to as Christians. So I hope that's at least somewhat helpful. It was a great question. All these are great questions. They're phenomenal questions.
Maybe we have time for one more question. Okay, all right. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Paul. And we have some copies of the book available. And do you want to make an announcement on that? And then we have some
Scones.
and scones. So,
Scones.
thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. Wonderful. Thank you so much.